on scientific evidence. And these are quite different from the able-bodied guidelines. And those that just heard Dr. Billinger's talk will have seen the stroke guidelines, and these are, again, are a little different. So we took a bit of a different approach. We said, what are the minimum amounts of exercise that people with spinal cord injury should be engaging in? And so for fitness, the evidence suggests that as little as 20 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity or aerobic exercise per week, 2 days per week, combined with strength training of 3 sets on those 2 days as well. So 3 sets of 8 to 10 repetitions of strength training are sufficient to improve aerobic fitness. Now, aerobic fitness is a little different from cardiovascular disease risk, and it does seem that the evidence suggests that to reduce cardiovascular disease risk, you have to engage in exercise for a little longer and on more times of the week. Now, I should emphasize that these were scientific guidelines, and these have now been published. There's a few notes that go alongside these. So again, in the scientific literature, we've now developed 2 guidelines, one for fitness and one for cardiovascular disease risk. Again, these are evidence-based, but they are minimum requirements. So it shouldn't be that everybody with spinal cord injury is trying to achieve this. It should be that this is the minimum amount of exercise. I won't read all of these. You can find these guidelines online now, but there's a couple of points to note is that most of the evidence is for adults. There isn't really any evidence for children on the role of physical activity after spinal cord injury, although we suspect it's similar. These guidelines hold whether it's someone with a cervical or a thoracic spinal cord injury, and they're irrespective of sex or race or socioeconomic status. So these are community-wide guidelines. The only note really is that the evidence today is based on the chronic individuals, and we know very little about individuals that are aging with spinal cord injury. So most of the evidence has studied people under the age of 65 years. And again, these are minimum guidelines, so exceeding these guidelines would be expected to yield greater benefits. Now, it's all well and good having these scientific guidelines that are in the scientific literature, but one of the things that we wanted to do differently this time was actually to make sure that these guidelines could make it into the hands of people with spinal cord injury and the community organizations. So I was fortunate to be part of a big group that kind of took around 12 to 18 months to go out to the community, speak with physiotherapists, doctors, occupational therapists, community organizations, and figure out the best way to translate these guidelines. One of the biggest things we were concerned with is that the evidence suggests there's 2 different guidelines depending on what it is that you want to achieve. And this can be quite hard to understand for someone that's new to exercise, like which one of these should I be going for? And so we went through a year-long process where we translated the scientific guidelines into community-based guidelines. And this is how we ended up doing it. And we got good feedback from the community that this was a good way to frame it. And so now we're suggesting that for people with spinal cord injury, the starting level should be the aerobic exercise guidelines. This is 20 minutes twice a week of aerobic type exercise at moderate to vigorous intensity, including strength training of 3 sets to 10 reps twice a week. And once you can kind of get going at this level, then the idea is to really move on to this advanced level, which is then to increase the duration to 30 minutes and get up to 3 times a week whilst maintaining strength training. And then once you get to this level, again, these are still minimum guidelines really. So the idea is to try and exceed them. And I've put this link here, this link, which I can post to the chat, will actually take you to a website that hosts these guidelines and talks about their development and ways in which you can start the exercise as well. For those interested in reading more about this, I can also link to this paper as well. This is basically a paper that describes how we developed these guidelines and the process we took from getting it from the scientific literature all the way through into consumers. And so I thought I would just switch gears here a little bit and share a couple of videos. The organization that I work at, ICORD, we work very closely with a Canadian group called SCIA. These are people that take academic evidence for spinal cord injury and translate it to the community. And one of the PhD students that was in my lab, Jasmine Ma, actually led a lot of this work. So I thought I'd just share a couple of videos now on, why perhaps do it and how to begin exercise. So hopefully this plays with some sound as well for you.
Exercising after an SCI is just as important as it is for able-bodied people. The benefits may be slower. You have to monitor things a little differently, but it is important that they try to find a way to exercise, and there is positive benefits if they do.
My philosophy on exercise, and especially working with people with spinal cord injury and disability, I think kind of focuses on the intersection between two things. Obviously, we want the program to be effective, but we also want it to be sustainable. You could have the most effective program in the world, but if people don't do it, it doesn't really matter. Good, awesome. Yeah, how can we help people to stick to their program, right? To make exercise and physical activity more of a lifestyle behavior.
The last, I guess it's about 6 years now, I've been working out at Park, stands for Physical Activity Research Center. I'm lucky that it's not too far from my home, so it's a place that I can access pretty much every day. Honestly, in the last 3 years or so, and being at Park all the time, I haven't had any problems, which is huge for me, not having to give up doing stuff, and even simple stuff like being independent and transferring on your own, that's stuff I'm not willing to give up or risk, and so it's worth the extra work that it sometimes is, but so far so good.
Some of the health benefits for exercise for people with SCI, some of them are very similar to the able-bodied population, but the big ones we think about are decreased risks for things like cardiovascular disease, things like decreased pain. You might see decreases in depression and anxiety, improved mood and energy, but one of the big things that I think is a particular motivator and a benefit is the social benefit, right? So maybe it means being part of a team or meeting new people. I think those are really important benefits to emphasize.
It's not something we often talk about, but I think that for a lot of people that would be one of the biggest things, just being in a safe environment where you're not going to have people judging you or looking at you for doing things differently, and you can feel comfortable to try things and ask questions and get whatever help it is you need.
So there's a lot of the social aspect of it as well that the gym offers and the exercise offers. There's a lot of camaraderie there.
I find it always interesting to see someone new that comes in, and it's kind of cool how some of us who are been here for years can connect with them and encourage them and say, hey, you know what, right now it sucks, you're feeling pretty weak, but keep coming, keep connecting, and changes will happen.
So I just want to pull out a couple of points there. Again, what you saw there was the Physical Activity Research Center. So we're very fortunate at our center where we work that we have this Physical Activity Research Center. It's a fully accessible gym that people with spinal cord injury can come to. We've got about 350 users of the gym now. And coming on board there, they actually agreed to come on and take part in some research studies as well, so we can track how effective the physical activity is being. I just want to share one more. I'm just going to share one more video on that's been put together, really, which gives some more practical information around how to begin, and then we're going to dive back into the presentation. So.
Assessing someone with SCI for strength training. It's a complicated question, and I can share how I would do something like that. Part of my philosophy is that, we focus on helping people to stick to their program. So first I'll usually start with some different types of assessment to get a sense for, how strong is the individual. And then as you're designing the program, it's a lot of monitoring, trial and error, and follow-up. So start slow, make sure that technique, we're doing a really good job with technique before we start increasing those weights and then working our way up.
So with cardiovascular fitness, most people with spinal cord injuries have a lower heart rate and blood pressure than normal. Because of that, heart rate and blood pressure is not a great measure for them. So how do you prescribe or determine what's a good level of exercise? And what we've found, and there's been lots of research, is the rate of perceived exertion, which is a scale. It's easy to use in the clinical setting.
So for example, you have them do 10 repetitions of an exercise and say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard was that? 10 being the heaviest thing you've ever lifted, 1 being light as a feather, how hard are you working? We're looking for maybe around 5 to 6.
Some of the problem that can happen with people is they will start exercising and they may start to feel nauseated, they may feel like they're going to pass out. And that's a very common response. It's called exertional or exercise-induced hypotension. And it is common and it can be overcome. But what you have to do is do a discontinuous approach to exercise, where they'll do 2 or 3 minutes, then take a break, and slowly increase the length of time that they're exercising. And generally, we would recommend that people get up to the 20 to 30 minutes of aerobic exercise continuously before they start increasing the workload. That is the most important thing, and most people with SCI can improve that. They just have to take a discontinuous approach rather than a continuous approach.
Other important aspects are muscle compensations. They can come from things, for example, perhaps certain muscles are inactive, some may be weaker than others, or it can even be in instances where someone might have spasticity. So you might do an alternative movement to make up for that muscle inactivity or imbalance there.
It can be difficult to assess and qualify, design an appropriate program for someone with SCI. So you need a lot of adaptations or accessories to help them be safe or balanced. Exercise is most definitely encouraged for everyone with a spinal cord injury, and the benefits are documented and well indicated, but it is good to always, when you're changing your activity levels, to get medical clearance or talk to health professionals about it.
And when you're selecting those activities, you want to ask, what's the goal? So if we can link what their goals are, their motivators for wanting to be physically active or programming, it creates more meaning, and perhaps hopefully that you're more likely to stick to it.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up on quite a few of the themes that come up there, certainly around some of the cardiovascular responses and how they change after spinal cord injury and why we might be seeing some of these responses. But before I do that, perhaps, Liz, if there's any questions, now would be a good time to take them.
Yeah, there's one question, and that was whether this video is available to the public online. Is it on? Is it on a website somewhere that people could have access to?
Yes, if on YouTube, if you just type in SCIA, I mean, I can post a link to them, but there's actually 5 or 6 videos that have been developed around physical activity and exercise prescription through the SCIA community. So they're all publicly available. There's many other videos on things for people with spinal cord injury outside of activity as well.
There's another question, and I know this is going to come up, I believe, later, but it is FES spike recommended for exercise benefits, even if it is passive, such as for a C3 to C4 complete spinal cord injured person?
Yeah, I'm gonna go through some of the different types of exercise, and I'll cover the lower limb exercise as well and the passive exercise. So perhaps I can pick that question back up later.
Sounds good.
All right, great. Okay, so what I wanted to cover next is some of those things that you heard about. You know, blood pressure can be really low, heart rate doesn't go quite so high when people with spinal cord injury exercise, and I actually want to go through some of the physiology about why that might be. So I'll try and take this a little slowly, but essentially, if we think about the main parts of our cardiovascular system, our heart and our blood vessels, then the way our heart and blood vessels is controlled, it's very similar to a muscle. So, you know, if we want to move a muscle, a nerve impulse gets transmitted down the spinal cord, it goes out to our muscle and we move that muscle. The heart and blood vessels, they're not really under our volitional control. We can't control them when we want. They're under the control of a different nervous system, which is automatic. It's called our autonomic nervous system. And there's essentially 2 arms to this. There's One shown here in blue, which is responsible for slowing down our heart rate and reducing our blood pressure. And then there's another one in green, which is responsible for exciting our heart, increasing our heart rate and increasing blood pressure in the arteries. The key difference between these two things is that some of those nerve impulses travel down the spinal cord before going to the heart and blood vessels, these ones in green, but the one in blue exits above the level of the spinal cord. So what this means is if you take someone with a cervical or high thoracic spinal cord injury, the nerve impulses that would usually go down the spinal cord to excite the heart and blood vessels don't make it, but the nerve impulses going through the blue one here to reduce heart rate and blood pressure do make it because they don't go down the spinal cord. And so for most people who have an injury between C2, C3, all the way down to this T6 region down here, it can mean that when individuals exercise, that the heart rate doesn't go up and the blood pressure doesn't go up because these nerves aren't able to be excited. And instead, you just really have activation through this other nervous system. And so what we're going to do now is focus mainly on individuals above T6. And we're going to look at some of the changes that can happen. I'll just show you one slide on the heart, on the brain, and on the blood vessels themselves. So here's an example of how we can look at the blood pressure response to exercise. Blood pressure can be quite difficult to measure during exercise, but one of the things we can do is we can take a person with spinal cord injury, have them laying down, and then we can move them from a supine up to a seated position. And that puts a stress on the system, not quite like exercise, but a little similar. And then because they're not exercising, we can easily measure blood pressure. And you can take one individual with a C6 and they may have a normal blood pressure despite a cervical injury. You can take another individual that might have some pretty profound orthostatic hypotension where blood pressure drops. And then you can have another individual that may really not be able to sustain their blood pressure in the seated position and can actually faint. And so how someone's blood pressure responds during this tilt test is quite indicative of how it responds after exercise as well. And so this is what they were talking about in the video with post-exercise hypotension. As the body stops exercising, the blood just pools in the abdominal and lower legs, and therefore blood pressure can drop down. One of the other things that happens, and certainly if you have a spinal cord injury, you're very aware of this, is something called autonomic dysreflexia. So again, this is for lesions above T6. This describes where the blood pressure goes the other way. It goes up really high, something like this. So this can be caused by something as innocuous as a tight shoelace, or more commonly by a full bladder bag. And essentially what that does is it just provides a stimulus to the spinal cord to excite the spinal cord, and the blood pressure then increases unopposed. It can be life-threatening in nature. And it's important to know that the blood pressure can still be quite low whilst this is happening, because resting blood pressure is a lot lower in people with spinal cord injury. This is kind of a cartoon drawing of some of the things that can cause it. So it's triggered by any stimuli that's below the level of the injury. And again, this is typically only apparent for individuals with a T6 injury. It can be restrictive clothing, shoelaces, belts, full bladder, any pressure ulcers, bowel impaction. And these are some of the symptoms. It can cause blood pressure to go up very severely and rapidly. Typically, individuals will be flushed in the face, sometimes get a headache. The heart rate goes down to try and compensate for this increase in blood pressure. And then you get this kind of dilation of the blood vessels above the injury. Below the injury, you get constriction of the blood vessels. And because that's where most blood vessels are, those blood vessels constrict, the skin can become very cool with no sweating, and then the blood pressure continues to go up. And this kind of goes around in a circle until you figure out what the stimuli is, and you need to remove the stimuli to prevent the blood pressure from continuing to spike. It can be pretty prevalent, and it can be caused by certain types of exercise as well, so it's always good to be cautious about this. It's most common in individuals above T6. The incidence has been reported to be anywhere up to 90% of individuals with a cervical or high thoracic injury, depending on the study. Mostly those with motor complete injuries, but it's also apparent in those with incomplete injuries as well. And it's really important to be aware of this, because if left untreated, there's certainly evidence that this can lead to stroke and in some cases even death. Outside of these blood pressure instabilities, we've done some research ourselves to actually just look at how the heart changes after spinal cord injury. And we do this just by imaging the heart with ultrasound. And we've looked at all of the studies that have ever taken this. And what we find across studies is this consistent response, which is the heart size gets smaller and the volume of blood in the heart gets lower after spinal cord injury. Next slide is for those that were around for Dr. Billinger's talk. She spoke a lot about this technique. You can actually measure brain blood flow using ultrasound of the brain arteries. And if you take someone supine and then you tilt them to the upright position, a bit like that sitting test did, what we find is that the blood flow in the brain is reduced to a greater degree in people with spinal cord injury versus without spinal cord injury. And then finally, if we look in the blood vessels themselves, we can make some measurements, again, using these small devices that we place on the arteries in the neck and the arteries in the leg. And we can look at how quickly the blood pressure waveform travels through the body. And this tells us about the stiffness of the blood vessels. And really, you want your blood vessels to be nice and compliant and not stiff. The higher this value that we derive, the stiffer the blood vessels. And what we found after spinal cord injury is that the blood vessels can be quite stiff. And so when you take these three things together, what this ends up resulting in is that if you actually measure fitness as peak oxygen uptake, it's much, much lower in both wheelchair ergometry and arm crank exercise in those with cervical injury versus those with low thoracic injury. And again, this is an injury below T6 and an injury in the cervical spinal cord. And this is so reduced because the cardiovascular system is just not able to respond effectively. So in addition to those, and it was good to see Dr. Billinger covered a lot of these things for stroke, we see some other classical signs of cardiovascular disease risk in people with spinal cord injury. We know there's an increased risk for type 2 diabetes. We know there's an increased prevalence of sleep disordered breathing. Although total cholesterol doesn't tend to be higher, the ratio between good and bad cholesterol is in the not good direction. And then the other thing that's become really apparent recently is that blood pressure, rather than being nice and stable throughout the day, because of this lost neural control over the blood vessels, can actually be very volatile. And what we mean by that is the blood pressure can swing between periods of very high and low blood pressure. And we think this swinging of the blood pressure can actually damage the blood vessels themselves. And so I'm just going to show you some evidence for this. We can actually measure this. We've done this in able-bodied individuals where we're measuring blood pressure 24 hours a day. And what you can see pretty nicely in an able-bodied individual is the blood pressure. It goes up and down a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, it kind of stays within this range during the day. For people with spinal cord injury, the blood pressure can be kind of very volatile. It can go up and down. And so you can see here, sometimes it goes up because of a kink in the urinary catheter during bowel routines. And so these are episodes of autonomic dysreflexia happening multiple times per day. And so we're just now starting to understand the effect of this high and low blood pressure swings on the blood vessels themselves. And so bringing that all together, what we typically find is that the risk for cardiovascular disease is amplified about 5 or 6-fold in people with spinal cord injury because of all of these changes to the cardiovascular system, in addition to some of those traditional risk factors. So I suspect there might be some questions there before I want to go on and just cover the last section of the talk, which will talk about around the role of regular exercise to improve some of these responses.
Well, we don't have questions right now. I'm glad this is this bummer of a section of your talk is going to be followed by what we can do.
Totally, yes.
And I just want to comment. I have an injury below T6, and I have bouts of autonomic dysreflexia. So it can happen. I don't want people to think that if they have a lower injury and they see these signs that that can't be it. Well, it can be. I know it's not normal or usual, but anyhow, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Like T6 is often given as that lower limit, but we've actually seen people injuries down to L2 that can have autonomic dysreflexia. It can be complicated to figure out why that might occur. But typically when you're assessed for your level and severity of injury, nobody is looking at your cardiovascular system. They're checking motor function and sensory function. And so some of the work I've been doing with my previous postdoc supervisor, Andrei Krasikov, has been trying to get assessments of autonomic function now included into the neurological classification for people with spinal cord injury. And separate, I don't have time in this talk, but we actually now have some standard examinations to look at autonomic function to try and better figure out who is at risk for the dysreflexia and the orthostatic hypotension.
Yeah, well, Dr. Krasiakov I spoke to him, and he's the one who confirmed that what was happening with me was autonomic dysreflexia. And mine appeared over time. Like it wasn't, also I've aged, hormonal changes, age, and years after injury. Also, there is a comment here, or a question. Let's see. This is so true. Many emergency departments don't know how to treat autonomic dysreflexia, and are there guidelines that can be used by them? Believe me, when I've gone in, I tell them what to do. Thank God I'm conscious. So anyhow.
Yes, that's a really important point, and really Dr. Krasikov, who I did my postdoc with, so I trained with him for quite a long time. He's really led the field in this area. And so now in BC, we've done outreach clinics to the hospital, not only the hospitals, also the first responders as well, because typically they're the ones that see individuals that are in dysreflexia. So everybody now, as part of their training, has to undergo a course in autonomic dysreflexia, and everybody that lives in British Columbia now actually carries a card with them called the ABC of AD, to inform people that might see them that aren't familiar with this, like how to treat them if they're having a dysreflexia episode. Unfortunately, that hasn't really got much traction outside of BC yet, but that's certainly an area that Dr. Krasikov, who's now actually president of the American Spinal Injuries Association, is working hard to try and get this put in internationally as well.
Great. Wait, here's another. There's someone, I do too. I carry a card with me from the PVA that explains what AD is, just in case. Yeah, I guess I always, I've had my problems when I don't have stuff on me. Yes, people should carry them. I just think that training is so important. So the burden isn't on us to carry the information with us but that is something I think is possible in Louisville, at least in Louisville or the area, because of the spinal cord program that's here and having Frazier Rehab located in Louisville. But anyhow, that's for another time.
For sure. Okay, so as you said, we'll move on from that section, which doesn't paint a particularly good picture. There is really good news out there, like physical activity and exercise can be very good for people with spinal cord injury, and that's really what I want to explore in this next section of the talk. And so, as you saw from the videos with Jasmine, who worked in my lab as a PhD student, we've been trying to be very pragmatic about our approach to increasing physical activity. We don't necessarily prescribe exercise in gyms. We do this in the home and out in the community. And we've actually now been able to measure physical activity as people move around their community. We do this by attaching devices to the wheelchair and to the wrists of people with spinal cord injury, so we can track where people go to get activity. And this is helping us to inform community design around the area that we're based to make it more accessible. When we actually set out to do this study, we were conscious that, everybody's arm movements may not mean the same thing between individuals from an energy expenditure point of view, which is what we're trying to achieve here. So we were actually careful to bring every single person into my lab, where we actually put people with spinal cord injury on a treadmill. We measured their energy expenditure and we related it to the counts that the accelerometer were getting up. So what this allowed us to do was actually to individualize the response to that person and identify on an individual by individual basis how much moderate to vigorous physical activity people were actually getting. And the good news is that those that engaged in more physical activity, these are different markers of heart health and heart size. Those that did more physical activity had better heart size and better heart health. I'll caution that this is cross-sectional, so it doesn't necessarily mean that if you take someone with spinal cord injury that doesn't exercise or isn't active and start them being active, that they will respond in this way. But certainly people that are more habitually active seem to have better heart function. So some good evidence that might be the case. Most of the evidence that is out there for physical activity and spinal cord injury is actually generated from exercise trials where people have brought individuals with spinal cord injury into the lab. So we set out to change this. We actually set out to do a bit of a different approach. And I realize this is a slightly busy slide, but I'll talk you through it. So we actually just conducted one of the first studies that's looked at putting in a pragmatic behavioral intervention, where we actually allocated groups of individuals to either a physical activity intervention or a control. The people that were in the control were initially in the control period for 8 weeks, and then they were allowed into the intervention after that. So everybody did eventually receive the intervention. This was an 8-week intervention, and I just want to highlight a couple of things here. So we did individualized personal training sessions where we had a personal trainer do an initial 1-hour consult where they went through everything from current and previous physical activity history to identifying some of the barriers that might be preventing people from getting physically active, looking at the different resources they had. We then took them through the new physical activity guidelines, trying to suggest they needed to get to at least 20 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity and strength training. And then on a week-by-week basis, we did virtual check-in coaching sessions for 15 minutes. We did goal setting throughout and then set new goals as we went on. And so this is very different from the other approaches in the field. Most people, as I say, bring people into a lab to do these exercise studies. This was all based out in the community. And what we were able to find, which was really nice, is that even just engaging in any form of physical activity was pretty much every single person that took part in this increased their fitness by about 15 to 20%. So this is a really functional increase in fitness compared to the control group, where if anything, they went down slightly over that same 8-week period. Unfortunately, when we looked at cardiovascular health indices like health of the heart and health of the arteries, we didn't really find any increases or any changes in those indices. But again, this was only an 8-week intervention. It probably means that you need to exercise for longer and more continuously. We've just finished the year follow-up to this study, and the people that were in the physical activity intervention group have managed to maintain their physical activity levels across the course of the year, really showing that this kind of behavioral approach to physical activity counseling can work. Can the cardiovascular system respond in people with spinal cord injury? There really haven't been any exercise trials that have followed people for long enough to answer that question. So what we've done is we've taken athletes with a cervical spinal cord injury and compared them to non-athletes with the same level of injury. And we find that the arteries are more compliant, they're less stiff. And if we look at measures of heart function, they're not quite back to able-bodied. This is our spinal cord injury athlete group here and our non-athlete group, but our indices of heart function are better in the athlete group. So this certainly suggests that after even cervical spinal cord injury, there is definitely still the capacity to increase the cardiovascular responses. But if we think back to this original slide, it probably means we need to get people up towards this advanced level and for people to try and keep at this level in order to get those cardiovascular responses. Again, just to note, we always get asked about the different types of exercise. Again, this doesn't have to be pushing in a wheelchair. There's many different forms of physical activity that's out there. And certainly variety across the activities is probably good. We know there's a lot of overuse injuries from constant pushing and carpal tunnel syndrome with just doing wheelchair propulsion. So certainly focusing on a variety of exercise and including strength training is really important. I want to spend the last bit of this talk just talking about how to monitor intensity in spinal cord injury because it can be a little different. But was there any questions before we do this last part, Liz?
No, not right now. I don't see any.
Okay. So tracking intensity for people with spinal cord injury can be quite challenging. And as you saw, this is because the heart rate response to exercise isn't what we would expect in an able-bodied individual. So typically, someone with cervical spinal cord injury may only get up to 100 or 120 beats per minute during exercise. And so that doesn't give much range to use to set a heart rate goal. And so what the field has really moved towards now is this idea, and you heard it in the video, of tracking intensity. And we do this on a 1 to 10 scale, which I realize is different to what Dr. Billinger just spoke about, where they use a 6 to 20 scale. We found the 1 to 10 scale to be a little more user-friendly, and the 6 to 20 scale was developed to be based on equivalent heart rates. And because the heart rate response is different in spinal cord injury, we've really used the 1 to 10 scale. And as you saw before, really, we want people to be somewhere in this kind of 4 or 5 up to 8 range, this moderate to vigorous physical activity. This can be hard for someone to understand that is just starting exercise. So we typically use some of these wordings like borderline uncomfortable or short of breath. Can still speak a sentence, but probably no more is vigorous. Whereas the moderate activity is where you can still be breathing a little heavily, but you can still hold a conversation. So somewhere in this region is where we're asking people to try and target. A lot of my research many years ago in spinal cord injury was actually looking at ways to boost exercise capacity to enable those exercise responses to be more beneficial. And the 2 things that I've researched most are either using an abdominal binder, which is really straightforward, or actually training the respiratory muscles using a breathing device that has some resistance attached to it. And so these things are all commercially available. You can buy many different forms of this. The idea behind the abdominal binder is that in cervical spinal cord injury, because abdominal muscle tone is lost, we have this what people call quad belly or tetra belly, where the belly sticks out a little bit. And if we use the abdominal binder, it can actually push the abdomen back in. And that not only helps breathing, but it actually also helps push blood back up towards the heart as well to increase heart function. And so we found with both the abdominal binder and the respiratory training that you can have better blood flow to the heart. It can increase your aerobic exercise capacity. It helps with the breathing capacity. And we found most people with spinal cord injury that use either one of these can actually exercise for longer. So these are some kind of easier ways that you can start to be able to boost the responses you can get during exercise. This is certainly the easiest. Respiratory muscle training just requires you to breathe in and out through this valve. And basically you can tighten that valve so you require more pressure to breathe in or more pressure to breathe out. And by applying that pressure, it acts just like resistance training, but for your breathing muscles. And so it helps to get those stronger, which can help with some blood flow profiles back to the heart as well. And then one of the things that we've become really interested in is actually looking at the role that lower limb exercise plays in this. There's many different ways you can do this. We use these 2 devices quite a lot, which is where somebody with spinal cord injury would be sitting on either the new step or the SciFit, and the legs are connected onto these foot pedals. They're strapped in either here or on here. And then by exercising the arms, the crank is connected to the legs. So by moving the arms, the legs either move in this kind of recumbent cyclical position or this upright cyclical position. And we've certainly found that if you do this type of exercise versus just arm exercise alone, that you can increase your aerobic fitness to a higher value. There's some these Berkel bikes that have been developed now to do this kind of exercise out in the community. And I want to emphasize that you can achieve these benefits even with passive lower limb exercise. Now, another way you can do this is to use functional electrical stimulation of the lower limbs, and that's probably better still. It's just that not everybody has access to a functional electrical stimulation setup. And for some individuals with spinal cord injury, if there's injuries to the peripheral nerves, the functional electrical stimulation can't be used. So if you have the capacity to do FES of the lower limbs tied in with active arm exercise, that's probably the best. But even just passively getting the lower limbs moving helps. This is just some data just showing that the VO2 peak or the aerobic exercise capacity is higher. Maybe not statistically significant, but functionally, again, this is about a 15% increase in VO2. And these exercise modalities work because they send more blood back up to the heart from the lower limbs. Just a few practical considerations. It can often be hard, certainly with resistance training for people with high-level spinal cord injury. So there exists many different gripping aids or strapping that you can use now to help with grip strength so that you can do some of the resistance exercises more effectively. I would say if you're exercising, certainly anywhere around Kentucky or the southern US, that we didn't get time to talk about this, but the core body temperature can go up quite a lot in people with spinal cord injury when they exercise. So it's always good to have a spray bottle around just to at least keep yourself feeling a little cooler. And where possible, try and keep an eye and be wary of blood pressure because it can go high or low with exercise. So it's try and keep an eye on that if possible. A few of the things to be aware of from a safety perspective, these were really covered in the video as well. It's this postural or exercise-induced hypotension, being aware of autonomic dysreflexia, changes in the body temperature, try and exercise in a what we call a neutral thermal environment, so not too hot, not too cold. Be very aware of any skin breakdown that can occur from being in the same position for a long period of time. And as I said before, try and have good variety in those programs to prevent overuse injuries. So bringing some of this stuff together, just a few take-home messages that physical activity and exercise is very important for people with spinal cord injury. As you saw, there's an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So really exercise and activity is one way we can offset that. So it takes on a bigger importance. Spinal cord injury can induce changes in the function of all parts of the cardiovascular system. And certainly data we've collected would suggest in the athletes that even after spinal cord injury, there's still the capacity to adapt the cardiovascular system and get the benefits from exercise. And just on another note, there are many, many helpful resources out there. I know Liz has some specific resources for the Kentucky area, and I'm happy to share some of the links as well to the SKYA presentations and to the spinal cord injury guidelines as well. I can post those into the chat function as well. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of the research councils and charities that have funded my research and the many members of my lab that have contributed to most of this work, and I'll happily take any questions.
Yeah, Chris, there are several questions. I wonder if you would stop sharing your screen, then I'll share my screen, and then we can go through some of the questions while
Sure.
people have an opportunity to look at some of the exercise and recreation options, at least in Louisville. I think when I do that, I can't see the, all right, so I have to stop sharing because I don't think I can see the chat there. So let me stop for a second and let's ask the questions. Here we go. I also want to go back to that question earlier about, is there any benefit to doing FES cycling, even if it's passive, for someone who has a high level C3, let's say, spinal cord injury complete? So if they're just, I think the question is, if they're just doing passive FES cycling, is there any benefit to that if they're doing nothing else? Do you know?
Yes, we actually had 3 individuals like that in that big physical activity trial that we talked about that could only do passive exercise. And I couldn't show this data, but on those 3 individuals, we still found that depending on which passive exercise it was doing, we found that there were local benefits to the vessels, blood vessels in that area. So if they were doing passive arm exercise, we found benefits in the brachial artery. If they were doing leg exercise, we found benefits in the femoral artery. I will say that the increasing fitness can be hard only through passive exercise, just because it doesn't put a great demand on the cardiovascular system. But from a disease risk perspective, we certainly see beneficial effects in the blood vessels where the passive exercise is being conducted. So again, if there is a way that you can use motorized passive exercise on the arms and legs combined, that would probably be most advantageous.
And did the passive cycling, did that also, I think you had mentioned it getting blood back. I don't know if doing it passively moves blood back up the legs or not. Or
yeah, even doing it, it's not as effective as moving blood back up to the heart as the FES cycling is. But we have been able to show that. A whole separate line of my research, which I haven't talked today, does basic science mechanistic research. And so we've been able to do some research to directly model the blood flow back to the heart. And even passive lower limb exercise does produce blood flow back to the heart. It does increase it. Not to the same extent as FES, but it does increase it more than doing no exercise in the lower limbs.
Okay. And what about, are there recommendations for someone with a long-standing shoulder aggravation or injury? I guess recommendations for exercise.
Yeah, we haven't really been able to delve into those. That's usually where we're fortunate in that we've used personal trainers and people that have worked with spinal cord injury for a long time to do the individualized programs. But that would be certainly a situation where it would be worth getting some input from a healthcare professional about the types of exercise for that specific situation. There isn't really any specific guidelines out there for what types of exercise should be done for people with specific injuries. So certainly an individualized approach there.
Yeah. Well, I wonder about having the arms cycling or having the arms in a more neutral position. Like I use a VitaGlide because I've had shoulder and wrist problems and having the arms less internally rotated has helped me do exercise for whatever that's worth. A Vitaglide is what I've found easier.
Yeah, for sure. That was part of our reasoning for giving different options for the combined exercise trial that we looked at, where we did the active arm exercise with the passive leg exercise. We had the new step and the SciFit. We actually did a whole separate study where we looked at the biomechanics of the movements and everything as well. So we were looking at different activation patterns in the different muscles as well. So there's definitely a few different options out there now that exist with those types of combined exercise machines that allow different movements in the upper limbs, but still exercising the lower limbs.
All right, well, I've got a long question here. Let's see, I wonder if, well, I'm going to go through it and we'll see if we might have to answer some offline and get it out to people or what. Here we go. From a very smart man here. What are the changes in basal metabolic rate with spinal cord injury? Differences between this and a para and a quad? Differences in higher level quad versus lower level quad? And also, are there shifts in macronutrient profiles needed for somebody with spinal cord injury versus able-bodied? I know that last question is very subjective depending on exercise goals and activity, but is there any baseline information that is different from the able-bodied population regarding the macronutrient profile? Got all that?
Okay. I got all that. Let me split that up into the different sections for the answers. So the first part of the question was about basal metabolic rate. It is lower in people with spinal cord injury. That's been shown quite a few times now. It's lowest in tetraplegics, and then paraplegics, and then able-bodied individuals. So it kind of follows that sympathetic innervation. So the higher the level of the injury, typically the lower the resting metabolic rate. It can be shifted by about 15 to 20%. There isn't any studies, to my knowledge, that have directly compared high quads versus low quads. So there's no one I don't know of any studies that have looked at a C3 to C5 versus C6 to C8 and done that on a large enough scale to be able to detect those differences. But certainly between tetra and para, there is a difference in resting metabolic rate. The next part of the question was about the shifts in the macronutrient profiles. On the nutrition side, we are only really just starting to get to grips with what's happening from a nutritional perspective after spinal cord injury. There isn't really any different guidelines out there right now, other than the total calorie count should be adjusted for people with spinal cord injury. So it probably needs to be brought down from the typical able-bodied recommendations by about 200 to 300 calories. So rather than 2,500 for a male or 2,000 for a female, it should probably be closer to 1,800 or 2,200 after spinal cord injury. In terms of the actual macronutrient content, the only studies out there that have really looked at this with an exercise perspective in mind have been done by Mark Nash in Miami, and has shown that the Mediterranean diet combined with the exercise is more effective than either alone. But that Mediterranean diet is very much still based on the able-bodied healthy eating guidelines. There's some very recent emerging evidence now around these high-fat, low-carbohydrate diets in spinal cord injury, but honestly, there isn't enough good data out there to say either way. So that's going to come down to a lot of individual preferences. Same with the intermittent fasting and what you're trying to achieve, but no specific guidelines for nutrition that are outside of the able-bodied, other than just reducing total energy requirements. But again, that should be done in line with your exercise levels. If you're someone that exercises very heavily, you're not going to want to reduce your energy content too far, because otherwise you won't have enough energy for the benefits of exercise.
Yeah. I have 2 more questions. One was the respiratory training device that you showed a picture of. I've not seen that. I don't know if that, where did you get that? Is that available in the US for just a regular person to purchase?
As far as I know, it is, yes. The respiratory muscle training work I did originally was where we just trained the inspiratory muscles. This is maybe getting a bit technical, but we just trained the inspiratory muscles, and that was the Power Breathe device, which certainly is available in Europe. I assumed it was available in North America. And we've more recently done combined inspiratory and expiratory training. I would have to look into whether those devices are publicly available. I'm not sure whether they are or not, but certainly there are many devices out there to just do the inspiratory muscle training, which is equally as effective as the combined training.
Yeah, well, there have been studies at Fraser Rehab on that, and I've actually used the device they use, but that's different than what you showed. And I was curious if it was commercially available for people to buy. Here's another question: is there an abdominal binder or similar device for someone with an ostomy? That is, well, I guess if you're, so let me add on to that question. How long are people keeping that binder on? Were you saying they were using it only while they exercise and then take it off? Yeah.
Yeah, for those studies, yes. The other studies that have looked at abdominal binding have typically been limited to the inpatient population from a blood pressure perspective. So I don't have a good answer to the question, but yeah, when we studied it, we were just asking them to put it on for the exercise.
Yeah, so it might be a question for your doctor. If the ostomy is for the colon, you might talk to your colorectal surgeon about putting a binder on for 30 minutes or 40 minutes while you exercise, or, you know, same thing if it's an ostomy related to the bladder, you might talk to your urologist about that. I think that's I've never heard that. That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, for sure.
The other thing, Chris, was the SciFit you showed, which had the pedals on the bottom and the arm cycle on the top. You showed it with the seat on there. Did you have people? You can slide that seat off, and people can roll up with a wheelchair. Did you use the pedals? I've used the SciFit, but I've never used the pedals. I don't know if the pedals work when you're in a wheelchair or if you have to transfer to the SciFit seat. That's a very specific question.
Yeah, so in that study, because we were also, and I didn't show the data today, but because we were also doing a full kinematic and biomechanics analysis with EMG as well to look at muscle activation, we actually didn't use the wheelchair or that seat. We had a custom made seat that people could use that was see-through that enabled us to track the kinematics during it as well. But I will say, and I don't think I showed it on there, practically everybody needed to use like the extended boots that come up from the pedals. You have like longer boots that come up that the legs go into. Certainly the people with higher level injuries would have those boots on there as well that the legs can be strapped into.
Okay, well, someone also mentioned that Eagle Sports, which I think is a local company, or maybe not local, company, makes a great comfortable binder for exercise for those people interested in that. So I want to, Chris, thank you so much. So interesting, really helpful. I'm going to go exercise right after this. We are going to have some prize-winning questions, but I also want to share my screen again so I don't have to look at the chat box. This will show there are adaptive recreational physical activity options in Louisville. I do want to highlight again that Gathering Strength Inc., my nonprofit, we're going to be doing some online classes. I'll let everybody know we're going to do a adapted yoga class. We're going to do a cardiovascular fitness class, and you can go to our website under classes and find those and register. Also, the Community Fitness and Wellness Gym at Fraser Rehab has a lot of the equipment we've been talking about and does a lot of the stuff that was in those videos that Chris played. There are new steps. There's the SciFit. There's especially trained staff who can do personal training and have a lot of experience doing that with people with paralysis of all sorts. So I just want to make sure people know about that. Coronavirus has changed everything. So a lot of these activities probably are not active right now, or at least not in the same way. But I just wanted people to see there's wheelchair basketball, although again, coronavirus, there's adaptive rowing, there's fencing, adaptive fencing, there's adaptive curling, and there's power soccer. So I'm also right now, I'm going to do an evaluation poll, and then we're going to do the prize question. So I'm going to launch this poll. Folks who are still around, please, please, please let us know what you think. What's gone well? There are questions in the chat box, or there should be. I can't get to it. Hopefully Patty has some qualitative questions in the chat box. What did you like best, and what would you have us improve? Please let us know. I am going to scoot down the shoot. Of course it's, oh, here we go. I'm going to try to get to the questions so folks can answer these questions to win a, of course I can't see what I'm doing. Nope, we're getting close. It would be good if I scrolled the correct screen. That would help. Nope. Nope. Getting to the SCI talk. Have mercy. No. I don't know why the screen is not moving. The screen is locked up. Dagnabbit. Well, I'm struggling. Here we go. Good gravy. Sorry, folks. I don't know if anybody's even sticking around for this. I'm getting there. It's just not responding. My gosh. Getting there. Hallelujah. Here we go, folks. If anybody's left, go to pollev.com/jjones. Okay, I don't know if you all are all there. pollev.com/jjones. Here we go. The first question. According to the new guidelines, how many minutes of aerobic exercise should people with spinal cord injury do? Okay, here we go. According to the new guidelines, how many minutes of aerobic exercise should people do? At least 20 minutes 2 times a week, at least 30 minutes 5 times a week, at least 45 minutes 7 times a week. Keep answering. Okay, again, people are not, oh, here we go, 1 second. All right, correct, A, at least 20 minutes 2 times a week. That's the minimum. Do more if you can. And the leaderboard guessed 536. Look up at the top of your, these are in order, so it was the first person to get the right answer. Guessed 536, go in the chat box and let us know who you are. And we're going to go on to the second question. You lucky few people who are left. It's you have a better chance. Odds are better. Odds are better. According to the guidelines, what are the 2 types of activities that people with spinal cord injury should do? Patty, did you write down that last number? Because I didn't do it. I hope you did.
We got it, Liz.
Okay. According to the guidelines, what are the 2 types of activities? I guess I didn't do it fast. Anaerobic and aerobic, aerobic exercise and strength training, none of the above. All right. It was aerobic and strength training. And guest 872. All right. So 872, let us know who you are. And that is, we're reaching the end. Oh, we've got a bunch in the chat. I don't know if that's comments or questions. Okay, good, good. Let's see. Just want to make sure. All right. So I don't see any more questions for Chris. You all, thanks so much. I mean, Chris and Sandy, to me, this is near and dear to my heart. I obviously have a chronic disabling condition. I want to know how I can help myself, how my healthcare providers can help me and encourage me, and how other people can can improve their health for a lifetime. So I'm grateful to the University of Kentucky's Wellness Edge project for funding for this, and other funders. Eurostat Healthcare made it possible for us to do these little gift cards. And thanks everybody for showing up and participating, asking such great questions. Please go to our webpage, gatheringstrength.org, and look at the classes and sign up for the classes as they come up. Email me if you have questions. We will find ways. I'll find a way. I can email everyone to the information about the PowerPoint slides and links that we shared from the chat. So I'll email that to everyone. And now I'll stop my gabbing and just thank everybody again for showing up. And hopefully we'll do this again. And I am going to now end it down here where it says end. Anybody have, well.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Patty, will the chat remain if I end the class right now?
So Liz, you can in the chat click the dot, and there should be a little save chat option.
All right. So I just don't want to lose. Yeah. Good.
I've saved it as well.
Okay. All right. Good deal. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sandy. Thanks, Chris. I hope we can do it again. I would love for you all to come here so we could do some hands-on stuff. Well, hopefully the coronavirus will go away, and my nephew brought over a puppy because I have not touched a mammal in like 7 months. So this has got to stop. It's got to stop. Well, anyhow, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yep. Thank you. Take care.
You too.